In Australia this week, shadows move behind the roar of engines as police tighten their grip on outlaw motorcycle networks. From sudden arrests to unfolding court battles, each headline hints at deeper tensions simmering beneath the surface of organised crime.
Police were busy clearing away dozens of motorcycles Monday evening from the parking lot of the Waco Twin Peaks restaurant, a reminder of Sunday's violent shootout between rival motorcycle gangs and police that left 9 bikers dead and 18 injured.
But what really happened across the country this week, and why does it matter? Before we dive in, hit like, subscribe, and let's begin. A deep growl of engines cut across northern Victoria last weekend, as more than 100 members of the Finks Motorcycle Club completed their annual national run into Melbourne, drawing a rare and intense police response. Riders on heavy cruisers rolled down highways from Wodonga toward Cranbourne West, the rumble echoing across towns that didn't expect such a spectacle or the serious law enforcement shadow that followed. This wasn't a simple weekend ride. Victoria Police, anticipating the Finks arrival, deployed specialist units, including the Echo Task Force and the Viper Task Force, setting up strategic checkpoints and vehicle inspections along key state corridors. These teams are among the lead units Victoria has been using to deter outlaw motorcycle crime. Viper alone has executed hundreds of search warrants and processed more than 1,000 offenders in organised crime operations over recent years, including prior Bikie targeting. For observers, there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Massive cruisers roaring past roadside cops, helmets glinting under late summer sun, law enforcement watching every turn. Patrol cars flanked Highway 31, while mobile units checked registrations and compliance on every passing bike. Senior figures within the Finks moved at the head of the procession, their presence amplifying both media attention and police concern. The club's reputation has long been marked by confrontations with authorities and links to serious crime, weaving a narrative that authorities insist they must interrupt wherever possible. The strong police presence this week reflects more than just traffic enforcement. It points to a growing debate among Australian jurisdictions about how to manage outlaw motorcycle clubs. Some states have tightened bans on club colours and insignia, making it harder for these groups to publicly display membership symbols, a shift that has pushed more events into states like Victoria, where legal grey areas still exist. In quiet towns and on long stretches of open road, it was clear this event wasn't just a ride, it was a reminder that bikie networks remain deeply woven into Australia's criminal tapestry. While bikies roared into Melbourne, in New South Wales, police were moving in on another gang matter. In New South Wales, a case that began in silence has now erupted into one of the most significant outlaw motorcycle arrests of the year. The incident traces back to 29 September 2025, when a 52-year-old man was found unconscious at a property in South Kempsey, suffering severe head injuries so serious that doctors placed him in a critical condition. Neighbours saw nothing. There were no arguments, no warnings, just a man left fighting for his life. What investigators uncovered in the months that followed painted a much darker picture. Intelligence units identified 3 vehicles arriving at the scene moments before the assault. Inside those cars were high-ranking members of the Bandidos Motorcycle Club, their movements deliberate and synchronized. It wasn't chaos, it was coordinated. Months of surveillance and forensic work brought the case to breaking point in January 2026, when the Raptor Squad launched a series of tightly planned arrests across 4 regional communities: Lake, Cathy, Thrumster, Verges Creek, and South Kempsey itself. 7 men, aged 31 to 72, were taken into custody. Among them were senior figures long watched by organised crime teams. Each man faced serious charges: reckless, grievous bodily harm in company, affray, and participation in a criminal group. Some were hit with additional counts after separate searches allegedly uncovered prohibited weapons and small quantities of illicit substances. Court documents describe the attack as prolonged and targeted, with prosecutors arguing the group acted in unison. During the first round of bail hearings, magistrates refused release for several of the accused, citing the gravity of the victim's injuries and the organised nature of the offence. Others were held on strict conditions, with repeated warnings about the risk of further interference. The case now sits in the hands of the courts, but the message sent this week is unmistakable. Even in quiet regional towns, the reach of organised motorcycle clubs remains a threat that law. Enforcement is determined to confront head-on up the coast in Queensland. Police were also closing in on Bikie-linked suspects over a case that began with an alleged kidnapping. Quiet streets of Mashans Beach, a coastal suburb better known for palm trees and fishing boats, investigators uncovered a far more sinister story. It began with the discovery of a woman who told officers she had been held against her will inside a property, threatened and forced into handing over money. The alleged intimidation didn't appear random. Detectives would later allege the situation had ties to one of the country's more unpredictable outlaw groups, the Lone Wolf Motorcycle Club. By late January 2026, the investigation stretched beyond a single address. Police executed raids across Cairns and surrounding suburbs, targeting individuals suspected of running a small but dangerous criminal network. Two men, aged 32 and 35, were arrested and charged with an array of offences: kidnapping, extortion, drug trafficking, assault, and deprivation of liberty. Court filings describe the conduct as methodical, with the accused allegedly using threats and forced confinement to pressure the victim. During the raids, authorities seized quantities of methamphetamine, cocaine, and cannabis, along with items believed to be linked to trafficking. Digital devices, cash bundles, and encrypted communication apps added to the picture of a tightly controlled operation. The older of the two accused was alleged to have connections to the Lone Wolf MC, not as a patched member, but as an associate who moved in the club's orbit, giving the case an added layer of concern. For organised crime teams, residents described the neighbourhood as unusually tense in the days that followed. Police vehicles lined streets normally reserved for tourists and early morning joggers. For many in far north Queensland, the arrests were a stark reminder that criminal activity tied to bikie groups doesn't only play out in big cities, it also settles quietly into regional pockets, where it can hide in plain sight. Both men remain before the courts, facing a long road of legal proceedings that could expand as forensic examinations continue. For investigators, the case is far from closed. It may be the opening to a wider network operating through the state's northern corridor. Further south in Queensland, a well-known bikie commander faced the courts. In Binley, a courtroom fell into a tense silence as Paya Langutu Talakai, the alleged commander of the Comanchero Gold Coast chapter, was brought before the magistrate. Talakai, a former rugby league player who transitioned from sporting fields to one of Australia's most notorious outlaw motorcycle groups, now stood accused of orchestrating a series of targeted extortion and arson incidents that rattled the Browns Plains community in January 2026. The allegations outlined a calculated pattern of intimidation. Prosecutors alleged that Talakai demanded large sums of money from a local business operator and used threats to enforce compliance. When the demands weren't met, a building linked to the victim was set alight, an act investigators described as deliberate and professionally executed. Fire crews arriving on scene found damage consistent with an accelerant, escalating the matter from intimidation to a serious arson investigation. Talakai, now 33, was arrested days later during a coordinated operation involving tactical and organised crime units. In court, he appeared calm but alert, flanked by security as his legal team argued unsuccessfully for bail. The magistrate cited several key concerns: Talakai's alleged leadership position within the Comanchero network, the sophistication of the offences, and the real possibility of interference with witnesses if he were released. The court emphasised that the charges carried significant prison time and that his influence within a declared criminal organisation raised the risk to public safety. Documents tendered during the hearing outlined prior intelligence linking Talakai to internal Comanchero disputes and ongoing enforcement activity by anti-organised crime teams. While none of these elements counted as convictions, their presence added weight to the magistrate's ruling. Bail was denied in full, and Talakai was remanded to await further hearings in the coming months. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was heavy. Police remained stationed at the entrance, and locals watched from a distance as one of the Gold Coast's highest-profile bikie figures was taken away. Underguard. Down in Queensland, south again, one of the most notorious bikie murders of the last decade continues to unfold in the courts. The shadows of October 2020 still hang heavily over Pimpama, where former Finks enforcer Shane Scott Bowden, 48, was ambushed in what investigators described as one of the most meticulously organised gang killings in recent Australian history. Bowden had returned to Queensland only weeks earlier after surviving a shooting in Melbourne. His attempt at a quiet reset ended violently when he was shot 21 times in the driveway of his home shortly after 12:10 a.m. This week, the case took a major step forward. 8 men, all allegedly linked to the Mongols Motorcycle Club, have now been formally committed to stand trial in the Brisbane Supreme Court. The group includes key figures prosecutors allege played specialised roles in a coordinated assassination: Ian Ronald Crowden, the alleged chapter president accused of managing logistics, Junior Toro, and James Mao, who investigators allege were among the shooters, and several others tasked with surveillance, transport, and cleanup. Court filings detail a plan that stretched across state lines and relied on layers of concealment. The accused are alleged to have used GPS tracking devices attached to Bowden's vehicle, encrypted messaging platforms to coordinate movements, and stolen cars fitted with false plates to approach and flee the scene. Security cameras captured a BMW and a Holden Commodore leaving the area minutes after the gunfire. Vehicles later linked to members of the group through forensic examination. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Defence teams challenged the strength of the circumstantial threads, but magistrates ruled the evidence substantial enough for all 8 to face a full Supreme Court trial. The proceedings will draw heavily on phone extractions, vehicle tracking data, cell tower mapping, and months of covert surveillance conducted between 2020 and 2023. For families, communities, and law enforcement, this case is more than a single act of violence. It is a window into long-running tensions between rival motorcycle groups and the lengths some will go to assert control. Those are the biggest updates this week, but here's where this fits into a long history of Australia's biker wars. Long before this week's arrests and court hearings, Australia had already witnessed how far outlaw motorcycle conflicts can spiral. One of the earliest and most defining moments unfolded on Father's Day.
Sunday, the 2nd of September, 1984, was a Father's Day.
September 1984 at the Viking Tavern in Milperra. There, tensions between the Bandidos and Comancheros erupted into a shootout that left 7 people dead, including a 14-year-old innocent bystander. The scale of the violence shocked a nation and changed policing forever. It triggered the introduction of strict firearm regulations across New South Wales, reshaping how authorities responded to organised motorcycle clubs for decades. But that event was only the beginning of a long, evolving history. The late 1990s saw rising disputes between the rebels, MC and rival groups, leading to weapon seizures, firebombings and regional turf clashes. In the mid-2000s, the Mongols expanded into Australia, intensifying competition for drug distribution networks and sparking conflicts that crossed state borders. Law enforcement task forces such as Strike Force Raptor, Echo and Maxima were formed in direct response to these escalating confrontations. Another moment that pushed the spotlight back onto bikie violence came in March 2009, when a fight between the Hells Angels and Comancheros at Sydney Airport ended with a man beaten to death in front of passengers. The public nature of the attack pushed governments to strengthen anti-gang laws nationwide, including control orders, consorting laws, and restrictions on displaying club insignia. Throughout the 2010s, Queensland became a battleground in its own right. Major crackdowns under the state's VLAD laws led to clubhouses being raided, hundreds of arrests, and several outlaw groups splintering into smaller chapters to avoid detection. These operations disrupted long-standing alliances and created unpredictable new rivalries, dynamics still playing out today. Looking back at these milestones, a clear pattern emerges. Whenever authorities tighten the rules, clubs adapt, regroup, and reassert themselves in new ways. Each major incident becomes another layer in a story stretching across decades, a constant push and pull between law enforcement and criminal factions fighting to maintain influence. And as we've seen, from Melbourne to the Gold Coast this week continued that long, complicated story. Across Australia, the pressure on outlaw motorcycle groups has reached a new intensity, not because of a single event, but because law enforcement agencies in 3 different states are now operating under sharper, more aggressive strategies designed to choke off Bikie influence before violence erupts. Each state has taken a different path, shaped by its own history and the clubs that operate within its borders. In Victoria, the turning point came as police began warning that the state risked becoming a safe zone for Bikies after tougher rules in neighbouring jurisdictions. Victoria has no blanket ban on displaying club colours, a gap that prompted renewed calls this week to enforce the Criminal Organisations Control Act against the so-called Big Six. This push is being spearheaded by specialised units like the Echo Task Force and Viper, which have expanded their operations in the past year. Viper alone surpassed 1,000 arrests in its first 2 years, targeting firearms, drug rings and Bikie-linked intimidation statewide. Meanwhile, New South Wales has taken a more direct, confrontational approach. The Raptor Squad, known for its zero-tolerance tactics, has intensified its presence across regional towns after a string of violent gang incidents. Raptor teams executed multiple arrest operations in January 2026 alone, and their enforcement model has recently been copied by ACT policing and newly formed disruption units in other states. NSW also enforces strict consorting laws, making it an offence for known gang members to associate, legislation that has fractured club meetings and disrupted recruitment pathways. Further north, Queensland has some of the harshest anti-gang measures in the country, shaped by years of conflict between groups like the Mongols, Finks and Rebels. Under the state's organised crime laws, clubhouses can be shut down, colours banned in licensed venues, and members face mandatory prison terms for certain gang-related offences. Units like Task Force Maxima have seized millions of dollars in drugs, cash and weapons since their formation. And this week's arrests tied to kidnapping and extortion show the strategy hasn't softened. The result is a fragmented national picture. Victoria battling club visibility, NSW crushing street-level organisation, and Queensland enforcing some of the toughest restrictions in the country. Each tactic reflects the same underlying reality. Bikie groups adapt, so policing must evolve even faster. Before we wrap up, let's look at some lesser-known groups and what they mean for Australia's Bikie landscape. Away from the major clubs dominating headlines, a quieter network of smaller outlaw motorcycle groups continues to move beneath the radar. Groups whose names rarely reach national news, yet whose activities demand just as much attention from organised crime squads across the country. These clubs don't always draw the crowds or headlines of the Comancheros or Mongols, but they remain capable of violence, extortion, and territorial influence that can destabilise entire regions. One of the most unpredictable is the Lone Wolf Motorcycle Club, known for operating without a rigid national structure. With chapters spread across eastern states, the group has been linked to drug trafficking and violent internal disputes. Their decentralised model makes surveillance difficult, and this week's kidnapping case in far north Queensland reinforced how associates connected to the Lone Wolf network can operate in isolated pockets with little warning. The notorious Motorcycle Club, founded in Sydney in the late 2000s, resurfaced in law enforcement briefings this year. Although the club declared itself dissolved in 2012, investigators believe remnants of the group still circulate through organised crime channels, particularly in Sydney's west. Notorious was historically associated with extortion and high-risk firearms trafficking. Patterns authorities fear could re-emerge as smaller groups attempt to reclaim lost ground. Another long-standing and less publicised outfit is the Black Uhlans Motorcycle Club, one of the country's oldest outlaw clubs. Originating in Victoria in the early 1970s, the group has been connected to firearms offences, methamphetamine networks, and alliances with larger OMCGs. Their numbers are smaller than in past decades, yet police intelligence reports regularly include the Uhlans in discussions about organised crime resilience due to their long history and deep regional ties. Finally, the Gypsy Jokers Motorcycle Club, with roots dating back to the 1960s, continues to maintain footholds across Western and South Australia. Over the years, the club has been investigated for violent feuds, large-scale drug production, and interstate alliances. Recent months have seen renewed activity involving property raids and asset seizures, particularly in WA's eastern suburbs, signalling that the group remains active despite reduced national visibility. What ties these smaller clubs together is not size, it's persistence. They adapt quietly, shift territories, and operate in the blind spots left when major clubs dominate headlines. For authorities, these groups represent the next wave of risk, less predictable, harder to map, and capable of escalating local tensions with little warning. A fragmented landscape, old rivalries simmering, and new players emerging. Australia's Bikie world remains anything but quiet as we move into another week. Over the past week, we've seen another wave of developments in Australia's ongoing battle with outlaw motorcycle gangs, from the Finks MC's heavily policed national run in Victoria, to 7 Bandidos members charged after a violent assault in South Kempsey, to kidnapping and extortion arrests in far north Queensland linked to alleged lone wolf associates, and the Comanchero commander Paya Talakai refused bail in Logan. We also watched 8 men committed to stand trial in the execution-style murder of Shane Bowden, underscoring how entrenched and complex these networks have become. Across multiple states, specialised squads and new legislative tools are being used to disrupt organised crime cells and stem violence. What do you think is the biggest challenge for police in tackling Bikie and outlaw motorcycle gang activity in Australia? Which region's developments stood out most to you this week, and why? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this update valuable, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next crime briefing. Thanks for watching.